Hello, welcome to the Restart Michigan webinar on workforce strategies for post-COVID recovery. This is Lori Ostro, Senior Director of Engagement with the Detroit Regional Chamber. Thank you for joining this session. The Chamber launched this series of webinars to help businesses across the state prepare to restart operations and return to work. I would like to thank our guest speakers from Deloitte for volunteering their time to share their expertise. Before we get started, I wanted to make you aware all participants are on mute, but you do have the option to submit questions directly to the speakers through the GoToWebinar control panel. I will now turn the webinar over to David Parent from Deloitte.
Thank you, Lori. This is David Parent here from Deloitte in Detroit, wishing you all a good day. And I certainly hope everyone is safe and well here in this challenging time. My colleague Terry Patterson and I are very pleased to be speaking to you today about workforce strategies in the post-COVID-19 recovery. Just a little brief introduction. I'm our managing principal here in Deloitte for the whole Michigan practice. We have about 1,100 people based in Detroit, Grand Rapids, Midland, and Lansing. And I also happen to specialize in the topic that we're covering today around workforce strategies and human capital related topics. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Terry Patterson, who, like myself, is a specialist in human capital and workforce transformation. Terry has 20 years of experience both in corporate HR positions and consulting around workforce topics. Terry and I are also joined by our colleague, Nicole Overly, who is one of our thought leaders on the topic of future of work. And Nicole will be helping us handle Q&A that comes in. You'll notice on your control box at the right, there's a way, even though you're all muted, you can enter questions using this tool. And Nicole is going to help us monitor your questions, and periodically we'll pause to answer questions along the way. Or we hope to leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to handle questions as well. So thank you for joining today, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the rest of the content. In terms of what we will talk about today, I'm going to do a brief setting the stage and overview, just to recap a little bit of where we are, where we've been in this journey, and set the stage a little bit about some of the frameworks that we use at Deloitte when we talk about COVID and the recovery stages. We're going to get specific, get more specific about returning to work. We know that's a hot topic in many organizations. We're going to share some of the frameworks, some of the considerations that we're using for our own organization, and we're using with other organizations, our clients, when we're helping them think through how they plan to return to work and progress through some of the next stages in the recovery. We're going to get very tactical and specific. One of the handouts that is available to you, and again, you can also see these handouts on the Chamber website or on your control box under handouts. There is a white paper that we have published that covers much of the content that we're talking about today. There's a second document that's called the Workforce Strategies Workbook, and we're going to highlight a few pages of that in the session today. This is meant to be extremely specific and tactical. It provides about 20 different categories of topics where you can review those pages and assess kind of where you are, what are some things to think about going forward. And we'll highlight a few of the maybe more interesting areas that we have found some organizations might need to spend a little more time thinking about beyond some of the more obvious ones about return to work. And then we'll wrap up quickly and have a few closing thoughts as we look ahead. I think one thing as we start out that it's important to say is there's no easy answers through this COVID journey, and specifically some of the workforce strategies and return to work topics that we're going to talk about today. I was in a meeting recently with someone where a gentleman paused and said, you know, are we overly complicating this? Can't we just find what is the right answer? What is the right answer? Well, that's easier said than done because there is no clear right answer, and there's a lot of moving pieces and there's a lot of different variables to consider, such as those shown on this slide. You know, what is right when you think about social responsibility and the situation we're in right now? What is right for the organization might be seen differently if you take a broader view. Time horizon is a very tough challenge. What is right in the short term may be different than what's right in the long term, and how do you balance those perspectives? There's a lot of different stakeholders involved, shareholders and owners and employees and customers and suppliers and vendors. So thinking about what is right could be different answer depending on what stakeholder you're talking about. Retention of key talent. You know, it's hard to believe, but just a few short months ago, most of our organizations were talking about we can't find the talent we need. Now some of those discussions are changing. So what is right in terms of key talent, and what is right in the short term versus long term, again, is a complicated answer. And of course, all of the above and other dimensions are wrapped up in human considerations: safety and health and well-being and prosperity and employment and income, change and dealing with change and feeling connected. There's so many human dimensions that are wrapped up in these decisions that make them even more complicated as well. So there is no single right answer, but our approach and what we'll talk about today is hopefully providing some tools and frameworks to think about at least some structured way of balancing some of these considerations as you think about different workforce strategy considerations, both now and going forward. So just a little more context about where we've been and our view of how we talk about the COVID recovery. So again, for this session, as you know from the title, Terry and I are going to focus on workforce strategy. As I was alluding to before, there are many different dimensions of the recovery you've had so far, the recovery you're planning ahead. These are all very important. A lot of attention on financials, on supply chain, on customers, on technology. We're going to focus on workforce strategies today, just to be clear. We'll at different points probably touch on elements of the others, but we are focused on workforce strategies. One thing I did want to call out, we refer to here on the left of the slide about command center, and there's many different ways you could think about it, but just a brief shout out or mention of one of the techniques that we have seen our own organization and many of our clients use, and it really comes from an understanding that the kind of organizational structures or the team structures, the leadership structures that were in place pre-COVID may require some adjustment to manage all of the volume of activity and all the various dimensions that we're talking about in a unique way, and probably in a more accelerated way, where information and communication is moving far faster than in normal situations. So we both have seen this used and recommend, if your organization is still trying to use it, kind of the same leadership model that it has in normal times. If it's working well, that's fantastic. If not, you might want to think about an approach like a command center or something similar to really allow for faster receipt of information, dissemination of information, communication, and ultimately decision making. At Deloitte, with the various points of view that we have published and in our conversations with our clients, when we talk about this COVID situation, and the framework we'll use today has basically two dimensions. One is the stages of the recovery. So we're using the language of respond, recover, and thrive. Respond is largely that initial response where there wasn't a lot of time to plan. We had to respond. All of our organizations had to respond quickly and really ensure kind of just short-term solutions to the vast and fast-paced things being thrown our way. Recovery is the next stage that we're going to spend most of the time talking about today, which is most of our organizations have made it through the respond phase, hopefully reasonably well, and now it's kind of looking ahead at what's next. And how do we start to look forward to get as closer to business as usual as we would like. And then thrive is really about long term. How do we sustain the progress, the improvements, and frankly, make adaptations that will allow us to thrive, allow our organizations, allow our people to thrive in the long term. The other framework that we use around workforce strategies in general, and it applies now as much as ever, is when we talk about workforce, we really talk about workforce, and workplace together. Ultimately, when we're talking about various workforce strategies, the workforce strategy depends on what work we're talking about, both the type of work, the nature of the work, the quantity of the work. And so we talk about work and workforce together. And then both of those combined dictate the workplace. The work that has to be done, how it will be done, and the workforce that is needed to do that work then dictates what is the workplace strategy that we need going forward. And these are some of the questions that we've been focused on, and we'll go a little bit deeper today. In Respond, it truly has been, for many of our organizations, what is mission critical and how do we keep those things sustained going forward as well and as smoothly as possible? How do we manage how do we transition to this new environment? And how do we effectively transition in many cases to a more virtual environment? Recover, now the questions start to morph toward, well, what is this change going to look like in the coming weeks and months? How do I start to get to a bit more business as usual or normal operations? We start to ask questions of how, now that we've made it through the initial period, what are the skills going forward? And ultimately, what is the return to work strategy from a workplace perspective? So if you're like us and many of our organizations, these are some of the questions that you've been dealing with, or some of the topics: getting virtual, technology to allow that virtual and that collaboration, some aspects of that rapid response team or the command center that I mentioned before. How do we organize to be effective in a fast-paced environment? And then crisis management tools and then virtual training, remote learning. Basically, how do we optimize performance in this new environment have been the focus of a lot of our activities to date. But now, hopefully, we have responded well, dealt with that initial volume of activity, and now the focus we and many of you are likely focused on are things about recovery and return to work. And I'm going to hand it over to Terry to talk a bit more about how we're viewing these topics and helping our clients think through them as well. Terry, over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, David. Appreciate it, and happy Friday to everyone. Although if you're like me, the days of the week are sort of blending together for you. But I'll remind you, it is Friday, and so great to be with you today. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and actually kind of continue along the same vein as David has introduced here, and start to go a little bit deeper and a little bit more tactical on this whole notion of, in particular, the recovery phase. And as David mentioned, we've found this whole Respond, Recover, Thrive framework to be a pretty useful way of taking a very structured approach to thinking about the things that you need to do now and do next and do later, in effect, as we all begin to think about it emerging from the present moment. And so what you see here is, the next click down on the kinds of things that go on in each of those. And what I might say just quickly here at the beginning, if you look at the left-hand column here around Respond, what we find in talking with organizations about this is that most businesses, most organizations really are still in that Respond phase and are beginning to think about the things that need to happen in terms of recover and even thrive in the bit longer term. But if you look down sort of that category of things that may already have check marks against them on the Respond category, David mentioned what's called here the Crisis Management Office or Command Center. And really the concept there is, what we find is that people are often working furiously, but maybe individually on a lot of the planning and actions that are taking place, and that a coordinated and especially a cross-functional way of looking at these things is really helpful from an organizational perspective. So then going to the center column here around what do you really need to be thinking about in terms of recovering and emerging. And we find it helpful to think about sort of two major buckets as you see indicated here. So the first one is really around people and places. And this is really, sort of looking at if you're going to do some modeling around the organization in terms of who comes back to work and when and what happens in terms of workplace decisions, that's really the first major bucket to be thinking about. And those kinds of decisions and considerations are often driven by cost and operational considerations. And then the next one is more from an organizational or a workforce perspective more broadly, thinking about more specifically which functions, even which roles and which people are you going to be thinking about in terms of maintaining continuity going forward? Do people continue working remotely? Certainly, even in the present situation, some essential workers are continuing to work on site in organizational facilities, if you want to think about it that way. But some of that will change moving forward, particularly in Michigan. We're all sort of tracking the announcements from the governor's office every day in terms of what's coming back online and when. And that translates for many of you into when do you begin changing the current setup in terms of where you have your people situated currently. So if you look at the bullets underneath organizational effectiveness, you can start to think about things like training, for example. How do you virtualize or digitize training? What sorts of tools do you need to make available in addition to the ones you may already be using? And what sorts of practices and policies may need to be rewritten as you sort of move people from situation to situation as you go forward here. And also foreshadow a little bit, even under the right-hand column, as you begin to think in the medium to longer term about what will it take to actually thrive in that sometimes hated but ubiquitous term around new normal, whatever that ends up looking like. You can start to see the things that people are taking into account around, do we need a new set of guiding principles for our workforce and our workplace decisions? Are there certain ways of working that will need to be changed, not just in terms of remote working versus in office or in operational facilities kinds of considerations, but how do people interact with each other on a more digital basis? Which kinds of work can be done in which kinds of those situations? What's the location footprint? Do you need as many physical locations as you have had in the past? Certainly there are real estate implications to this. I was on a call the other day with a partner firm of ours that had been looking at real estate implications and looking at large office buildings and how do you even do things as simple as loading a building in the age of social distancing. And this study showed that it took 2.5 hours in the morning and another 2.5 hours in the evening just to get people up and down the elevators to their office locations. So the question becomes, can you even return to work under those kinds of circumstances? So, looking forward, those are the kinds of considerations and decision points that people are taking into account. So this next view here is the first of two different 2x2 matrices that we're going to show you today. And the purpose of putting these out there and having a look at them is really to put some structure and some context into the various levels of decisions that you're faced with today. And so if you take a look at this one, what you see on the vertical axis here is really looking at workplace decisions in terms of what's the level of feasibility of continuing remote work for those people that are working remotely today. And we know in a lot of cases, that's many of us are doing that today. The horizontal aspect here is thinking of it in terms of the health risk. And so this is referred to as public health risk, or really you can translate it for our purposes today into workforce health risk. And looking at this is, the two on the right are really in some ways the most interesting and perhaps most impactful. So taking first the upper right corner here, if you've got situations where it is highly feasible for people to work remotely, and there's a high health risk associated with it. These are situations where virtual work may need to take effect on a long-term basis. So one of the interesting things, and maybe you've seen some of these data and some of these studies, is that in terms of the productivity aspect of people working remotely or working virtually, I think there was a common wisdom that productivity levels may suffer with people working remotely or working virtually. And in fact, what many of the data and studies are showing is that that's not the case. And in fact, in many cases, people are more productive working virtually. So in those instances where jobs or tasks or activities lend themselves to remote work, and by the way, there's a higher health risk, those are obvious candidates to continue the current setup. And a little bit of similarity to the lower right there, where still high health risk, but doesn't lend itself to remote work. Now, these might be, really reimagining workplace implications. So not only should, the work, the tasks, the roles in these situations probably remain remote, but it begins to say, do you make more concerned or more concerted efforts to think about work locations, real estate investments, and those kinds of things where you actually don't need as many physical locations as you may have in the past. The right-hand side of this page is really, I would think about it in terms of enabling actions or tools as you work your way through some of the decision points that are suggested by the matrix. And so, for example, policies. Many of you have been into this already, but there may be certain policies or practices that need to be rewritten for the new ways of working that in the future. Certainly in terms of learning and training, we've been working with a number of different organizations to take the training, the programs, the curricula that they have in place today, and very quickly virtualizing or digitizing those so that learning can be delivered much more in the flow of work and much more in concert with the remote basis on which people are working today. There's also collaboration tools. Many of us are using Teams or other kinds of collaboration tools, Slack and other things in the workplace. These will become far more common and ubiquitous probably in the future. We've all gotten used to Zoom calls, I know, even for, if it's not for work, for happy hours, if nothing else. I know many of us have been on virtual happy hours with family and friends to try and maintain some sense of normalcy here. These kinds of tools, even 2 months ago, were not nearly as ubiquitous as they are now, but they're going to become far more common and much more embedded, obviously. And the last point here on the lower right that I'll point out is the one in terms of leadership and culture. In fact, David's going to talk a little bit more about this in a few moments here, but maybe an underappreciated aspect of this is what's the role of the leaders of your organization in terms of setting the tone, in terms of visible communications and messaging to your workforce, especially as some of these changes become more permanent, and especially the impact that they may have on the culture and the workforce experience. So this whole notion of what does it feel like to come to work every day has changed very significantly, obviously, in the last few weeks. Some of those changes may be more permanent in nature. What does that do to what it means to work for this organization or that organization? So the next couple of pages will go just a little bit deeper on some things to think about in terms of determining from a workforce perspective who comes back, who stays where they are, who assumes a different kind of approach entirely. And I would say the theme of the next couple of pages is really around how do you begin to segment your workforce? Certainly you've already started to do that, but some of the things we've been seeing that are effective out there in the marketplace are the kinds of things that we'll talk about here. And if you look at the sort of bell curve visual on the right, the outliers here on the left side of the diagram and on the right are probably a bit more obvious. So in terms of what kinds of activities really need to be on site at a work location, things like facilities management we've made note of here, or mail service, things that aren't noted on the page that are maybe more obvious, especially given the nature of many of our operations in Southeast Michigan and the Detroit area, manufacturing or operational kinds of setting, retail, restaurants, gyms, these kinds of things where there's a lot of high-touch customer interaction, or operation or manufacturing kinds of things. Obviously, those kinds of workforce segments and roles fall on the left side of this continuum. On the right side, again, maybe somewhat more obvious, are jobs that can really remain remote. So people that are working at call centers, people that are relationship managers, you see the one noted here, people that can really operate pretty effectively with the kinds of digital and virtual tools we have in place today. And that sort of leaves this big bulge in the middle about, there's a little more gray area on some of the functions and some of the roles where you need to think a little longer and harder about, should people come back to work to a physical location or not? And so the factors to take into account as you're making these kinds of decisions, you see listed on the left-hand side of the page here. So in terms of doing this analysis, the suggestion is to break down the jobs that you have into functional demarcations or work outputs or roles themselves. And think about things in terms of, where is collaboration higher on the scale, and where do really people need access to face-to-face collaboration as opposed to virtual collaboration? What sort of frequency of on-site presence is required? So maybe people don't need to be at work every single day. Maybe 20% of their time can be spent in a physical location in the interest of culture and in the interest of customer experience and so forth, but maybe it's not 5 days a week or 7 days a week. The other big thing here is, you see it listed on the bottom under personal factors here. And there may be, in terms of confidentiality or other considerations, where it's just not practical for people to work from home. This is a kind of another layer of decision making that needs to be taken into account here. So one click deeper, and this is a tool that really may come in handy for many of you. As I mentioned, this is the second of the two sort of 2x2 matrices that we've been using with client organizations, and that you may find helpful to use yourself in your own situations. And that is to really take essentially a functional view of the segments of your workforce and how that lays out. You see the vertical and horizontal axes have changed a little bit here. The vertical axis now is looking at what work is more individual in nature versus collaborative in nature. And then the horizontal aspect here is, what jobs can be done, what activities can be done more on site as opposed to more work from home. And the sort of green shaded there area under target zone, if you're thinking about how to more permanently virtualize some of these activities, you see some of the, this is kind of an initial hypothesis based on what we've been seeing so far about those functions that may lend themselves to this. So as a couple of examples, many procurement activities are done by individuals. They may be working in teams, but teams that can be done using virtual collaboration. But many of the tools and engagement kinds of activities that supply chain people are engaged in, can in fact be done on a remote or virtual basis, as opposed to, if you look at operations and facilities here, clearly these things would lie more on the left-hand side of the spectrum, where they need to be in physical locations. Functions like IT, HR, finance, sort of typically back of the house functions, you may find yourselves segmenting even some of those roles above and below the line, almost on a role-based basis as opposed to a functional-based basis. So in the case of HR, and I would assume some of the folks attending today's conference are HR people, we've got that sort of straddling the line here between work from home and working from on-site. If, for example, you're concerned with safety and health in the workplace, in an operational or manufacturing setting, that type of work lends itself to a requirement to be on-site. Whereas other kinds of HR work, in terms of perhaps benefits or call centers, can be done remotely. Then the other factor here is this whole notion of collaboration versus individual. I know many of you have moved to agile ways of working in the past few years. And so one of the big considerations we've been talking about with clients is when you're looking at agile teams, if you're far along that path and teams are already well versed in working together cross-functionally in sprints to come up with minimal viable products and services, those kinds of collaborative activities may well lend themselves to continued virtual work. Whereas organizations that are earlier on in that journey, may still require more on-site presence to get those ways of working up and running, if you will. Some of the factors on the left before we move on from this one in terms of the dimensions you'll want to use for this kind of evaluation are listed there. So we mentioned function and sub-function. In terms of roles, which ones are really mission critical? I know many of you are making those kinds of determinations already. Operationally critical, mission critical has been a basis on which people have made some of these kinds of decisions. Are people interacting with customers, and on what basis are they doing that? And then personal factors such as what's the experience of the workforce? How well versed are people? How new to their roles? How much training do they need? What sort of infrastructure are you required to provide for people to allow them to work from home effectively? How long have they been with the organization? And the last term here, business chemistry, you may or may not be familiar with this term. Business chemistry is a way we use of determining people's interpersonal communication styles and sort of their collaboration approaches. And so it's one way of determining how do you put teams together on a virtual basis. Do you have people who are by nature introverts, extroverts? Are they drivers? Are they more pioneering in the way they interact with people? Or are they more guardians? Are they more careful and data-based in the way they approach things? It's very much a diversity and inclusion way of looking at things, but that will also need to come into play here as you make these kinds of decisions. So the last thing I'll show you is, one more page, and this is a fairly detailed slide here, but I know many organizations are undertaking some fairly complex scenario planning for all the kinds of different factors, and you can see just by glancing at this page that there's a long list of factors and dimensions that you need to take into account as you're doing scenario planning for bringing people back to work and on what basis you're bringing them back to work. I'll take just a couple of these by way of example. If you look under the workforce scenario modeling section here, the darker gray box called segmentation and baseline, there are a number of factors here that you can use to segment the workforce. So full-time versus part-time is an obvious one. On balance sheet versus off balance sheet may be a little less obvious. What we're finding today in the age of many different kinds of alternative workforces, from fully badged permanent employees all the way through to contractors and gig workers, and even increasingly machine-supported, cognitive-supported ways of getting work done. All of those occupy different places on your balance sheet, and that'll be one of the ways in which you're going to be looking at these scenario modeling situations. Manager versus staff, exempt versus non-exempt. You can read these things as easily as I can, but all of these are factors and dimensions that you'll need to take into account. Location obviously rises to the top of the list in what we're dealing with today. And then the last thing I'll point out here under the header potential workforce management options, you see 3 boxes there and a number of different kinds of options that people are considering, and probably many of you have already been through a lot of things on this list. So is it a furlough? Is it a reduction in force? Is it temporary? Is it permanent? How do you bring people back as things kind of resume more normalized operations? So you see that under workforce planning considerations, a lot of those kinds of things in terms of shift pay. I'm sure some people are drawing hazard duty pay in the current environment. How do you ramp up from those kinds of things? The middle column under spend optimization considerations, you see things like deferring bonus payments. So there are actions that people are considering that are not permanent in nature, but more temporary as we continue to some sort of a glide path out of this. And so merit reductions, deferral of bonus payments, temporary adjustments of certain benefits. These are things that people are using as last resorts in many cases, but with the hit that the economy in general has taken and many of our operations have taken, these are actions that many employers have found necessary in the near term. And then in the longer term, as we move to thrive, may be able to return to more normal kinds of situations. And then on the right-hand column on that row, remaining workforce engagement considerations, even broader things like fitness subsidies and childcare benefits, people's situations in terms of, how do you take care of family members? How do you take care of kids, people in sandwich generations? All of these are coming into play. So I won't belabor this anymore, but just an indication of the sort of complex web of different kinds of factors and dimensions that you'll need to be taking into account as you work through the scenarios here. And hopefully this will form a bit of a useful reference tool for you. And on that count, I'll hand back to David now. And as he mentioned at the top of the webcast here, there's a tool, a workbook that has been provided that may be useful for you to actually put a lot of these considerations into play. So David, back over to you on that.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. We were going to take a pause here for questions. I'm not seeing any questions through the tool, but just to confirm, Nicole, do you see any questions so far?
I do not. Nope, no questions.
Okay, so we'll pause again in 10 to 15 minutes. So if you do have questions, feel free to enter those through the tool at the right-hand side. So to get even more tactical, as Terry mentioned, we do have this workbook. You can download it at the Chamber's website as well as from the handouts icon here at the right side of your screen. And using the construct that we talked about before, the workforce, workplace, as well as it's organized by respond, recover, and thrive, we've created this tool across 20 plus categories that ask a lot of the very specific kinds of questions that we think an organization needs to think through across these different dimensions. And we're not going to try to go through all of those categories today, but we thought we'd hit on a few that touch in areas that are maybe a little less obvious than things you might already be thinking about or focused on. So one of these is around vendor management. I'm going to use the term vendor here quite loosely. I think there's two main kind of areas that I think are important to think about when we're talking about return to work. One is what I might call contractors or staff augmentation, or Terry referred to on balance sheet or off balance sheet workforce. I think a lot of us in leadership roles, when we're thinking about how do we return to work, and many of the questions Terry talked about of who and when and what functions, we're probably thinking highly about our kind of traditional full-time on balance sheet employees. And I think that's only natural. But I do think as part of this, we need to broaden our thinking to make sure we also are taking into account the broader set of our quote unquote workforce, whether those are 1099s or consultants or other gig workers, part-time work, whatever it might be. We need to make sure our planning, our thinking thinks about our workforce broadly defined, not just our core traditional employees. And then, of course, when we talk about vendor management, I think we also need to be thinking about various service providers that we may have in our operations, in our locations, or in our offices, which again, I think might be a little easy to overlook because many of those things, when we're in our day-to-day, we don't think about things like custodial services or security or food and beverage services, or a whole slew of different services that in normal operations, especially at a leadership level, you might not ever give much thought to. But now in this environment, the questions become a little more complex of which services do I need to fully be operational? Do I really need those services or not in this environment? Do I want those services from a health perspective and interaction perspective, or am I just making things more complex by trying to bring some of those services into the equation. So I think there's some really good questions to think about, both for the broader workforce and for various kinds of services that you might need or might have in a quote unquote normal operational mode. This one we haven't probably talked about enough, but I think it's at the center of a lot of what we're doing internally within our firm, and what we would advise our clients is really thinking about workforce experience, both from the perspective of being sensitive to, Terry alluded to some of these before, some of the human dimensions of these changes, of working virtually or trying to work in a team environment where we're used to working side by side and we're not able to do that as well. Of course, trying to be sensitive and even helpful on some of the challenges of parents at home trying to work while they're also trying to take care of their children because the schools are out, et cetera, et cetera. So I think being extra sensitive now is important across all of these dimensions, both the personal or human side. Are we doing everything we can to help our workforce address some of the personal side challenges of the situation? More from a work perspective, are we doing everything we can to make sure people are connected, that teams are connected, that people are receiving the information they need in an effective way, that they have ways of sharing their perspectives and feedback to their management, their leadership, so that we have that information to make adjustments and make decisions. And I guess I'd summarize the point here. In our firm, we sometimes use a term called moments that matter. Moments that matter. And in our experience, there's moments that matter for our own organization or for clients, or whether individually or organizationally. And when it comes to our people and our workforce, I think this is a very significant moment that matters. And our people are going to remember how effectively we managed through this situation, how well attuned we were to their personal issues, constraints, needs. Were we effective in communicating? So now, while we're thinking about a lot of tactical things like when do we return to work and who and in what numbers and et cetera, workforce experience is probably a good time to double down on paying attention to the engagement of our people and how are we showing ourselves as an organization to our people. Terry alluded to this one before. Interesting times around leadership, and I'll touch on a couple of the considerations here. It might seem like a weird time to talk about something like succession planning, but one could argue succession planning right now might be as important as ever. And I'll come at it from a couple perspectives. One, I've actually seen in the news, business news and traditional news, there have been leaders leaving some organizations right now. I noticed that the chief financial officer of a state government retired. That person was eligible to retire and within the past couple of weeks decided to retire. And when you think about it, it's not completely surprising. For some organizations, including government entities, the next number of weeks, months, maybe even longer are not necessarily going to be fun ones, if you will. So some leaders who have other options like retirement might be wondering, how much do I really want to be involved in some of these very difficult situations? Another leadership consideration is a little like what you talked about with the command center idea or other response considerations around, the kind of leaders we have right now. Not talking about making changes, but some leaders are better at some things than others, and the skill set that might have been very effective 6 months ago in a leader or a leadership team might not be exactly what we need right now. And so again, now's not the time to make wholesale changes, but what I'm suggesting is now is a time to think about, are our leadership teams working effectively? If they could use some help on certain skills, who can we put side by side to help make sure we're bringing those skills? Maybe it's a more operational mindset. Maybe it's a more tactical mindset. Maybe it's a more human mindset on how we communicate with our people. Whatever the case might be, now is probably a good time to ask how effective we are as a leader or leadership team, and what tweaks can we make to that to make sure we are managing all of the different pieces effectively. And then the last topic we'll talk about from the workbook, and then we'll bring this to a close, is around workspaces. Now, you'll notice Terry and I didn't spend a lot of time, and there's a section in the workbook more about health and safety measures. There's a lot of guidance that has been out from the federal government, from individual state governments. There's additional guidance here in Michigan coming out from the Michigan Economic Recovery Council. So that area is outside of our expertise, so we didn't touch on it, but obviously a lot of these questions about return to work and things around questions like testing and wearing masks in the workplace, or do you screen workers before they come in the office? Those are all questions that an organization does need to consider. There are other venues for that information. So we didn't try to touch on that here, but I didn't want to overlook that. Those are obviously very critical when we talk about return to work considerations. What on workspaces, this is really thinking about, I think in Recover and especially in Thrive, I think it's fair to say at least some organizations will rethink what even the definition of a facility or an office really means. I've been interacting with an organization that, similar to what Terry said before, they thought they would see very significant drops in productivity when they moved to a more virtual environment. And that organization actually has not found a dip, and in some regards actually is performing better in a virtual environment than they were before. And that organization is really thinking hard about rethinking what model are they going to return to. Are they just going to try to return to where they were before in terms of how they use space and where they had people and such? And they're really giving hard thought about changing that model altogether, because in this new environment, they've learned some things about what they're able to do that they didn't expect, and there were some upside benefits. Our own organization, as I mentioned earlier, I'm responsible for our 4 offices in Michigan. There's communication, conversations happening of when we return to work, we may rethink what our office means, how we use that office. We might use that space differently than just assuming we're returning to the same kind of model that we had even just a few months ago. So workspaces, again, the broader point that we made before is depending on the work and the workforce, those should drive what workspace you need. But I think the interesting question here is, do we need the same workspace that we needed before, or now in a new model, might that look different? So again, this workbook is available on the Chamber website, here on the handouts, and we think it could be useful even just to do a page flip through across the 20-some categories and just do it as a self-check. Have we talked about these topics in our organization? Do we have plans for them or not? An exercise like you see on the screen might just be a useful, quick self-assessment to make sure your plans are as complete as possible. So to wrap up, and then we'll pause for any questions we've received, looking ahead and focusing what is most important. Really, what we would say, we know we have representatives from many different industries. We have big companies, smaller companies, and in between, different types of workforces. So a few closing thoughts on principles, guiding principles that we believe are important to consider as you make the assessments and the decisions that Terry and I have talked about today about your return to work strategy, your workforce strategies. These are some things that we think are kind of the headlines to keep in mind on all of these considerations and decisions. Obviously, first and foremost, safety for your people. As I mentioned before, this is a moment that matters for our organizations and for our people. And our people are going to expect and remember both these first 2 points, really, both how we prioritize their safety and their well-being, both their mental well-being and their physical well-being. And they're going to remember communication. How well did we communicate? Were we transparent? Were we concise? Were we clear? Did we receive feedback? How did we communicate is also a very important principle, and now would be a time to double down on both communicating outward to your workforce, but also receiving, making sure those feedback channels are clear, open, and wide to pulse where your workforce is, both individually and at the team level, functional level, and collectively. The third point really is, as I mentioned about the organization a few moments ago, I think there's learning going on. I know we're learning about ourselves. I think many organizations are learning. So Terry mentioned the term new normal that's getting a lot of attention, or here we say next normal. I think it is important to reflect on what we're learning about our people, our operations, and so on, our customers, and not just assuming that returning means returning to where we were just a few months ago, but is there a different model now that we're working toward that will actually be better, more effective, more productive for our organizations? As we mentioned before, it really should be the work and the workforce and what your plans are around those that drive the workforce, the workplace decisions. The fact that you have a facility or an office or what have you, that in and of itself is not an isolated decision. The three, work, workforce, workplace, really in concert should be what you think about on your plans. And this last point, again, is about, I think we've experienced this, I think other organizations have experienced this. The more communication, the more transparent the communication, and frankly, the conciseness and the clarity of communication, as well as the flip side, the effectiveness of those feedback channels, that yields confidence to our workforces, in confidence in our plans, confidence in our leaders, so that we can, as we progress through those stages from response to recovery to thrive, that there are solid plans and effective leaders, effective leadership teams, effective organizations that will allow us to be successful working through those stages and hopefully getting back to as normal of a situation as possible as soon as possible. So that is the end of our presentation. We'll pause again for any questions you have. I'm not seeing any in the tool here. Nicole, any questions?
I'm not seeing any either, so we'll wait a few minutes to see as they come in.
Okay. Not seeing any questions come in, and being respectful of people's time. Thank you again for joining our webinar today. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I hope you all are well, and I wish you the best as you go through these stages of recovery. And with that said, I'll pass it back to you, Lori, to bring the webinar to a close.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry and David, for your webinar today, and all of your team at Deloitte. That was very informative. To the participants, I want to thank you as well for your time and let you know that I will be sending an email later today with an audio of this session along with the materials. And please visit our website, detroitchamber.com/COVID-19 for upcoming schedules for webinars, as well as our teletown halls and any other information you may need. Again, we appreciate everyone's time today, and have a great Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.